This won't be a theory talk, it's an artist's talk, but hopefully an object that may be theorized by those of you who are so inclined. I'll introduce and show 3 of my projection pieces. All are intended to be installed in a gallery and to loop after no more than 10 minutes, which is to say they are not designed to be seen in a setting such as the one we're in now. More about this later. By the way, let me know, is the sound okay at the back? Okay, just let me know if it's not. Before screening the first of the pieces, I'll say where I see the works as located, by reminding you of the historical path into the field of representations we now all inherit and inhabit. Before screening the second of the works, I'll say how I understand the institutional site of my practice, that of the gallery, to entail specific formal consequences for the work. I'll follow this second piece with some observations about text-image relations in the work and the kind of object that they describe. I'll then introduce and show the last of the 3 works, after which I look forward to hearing any thoughts you might have in response. As I say, although this is to be an artist's talk, I hope that my own work may serve to metonymically or symptomatically represent issues of more general interest. The presentation will last about an hour. A New Yorker cartoon shows 2 people in medieval dress walking in an architectural environment of crazily incompatible vanishing points. One of them is saying, "I won't be sorry when they have this perspective thing worked out." The perspective thing was worked out in Italy around 1420, when Filippo Brunelleschi applied principles of optics and geometry to painting. Although based on natural phenomena, the physics of light, and the physiology and psychology of visual perception, the perspectival system of representation is not in itself natural, nor, as the pictorial traditions of Islam and such civilizations as those of Egypt and China demonstrate, is it inevitable. Nevertheless, it has framed hegemonic representations of the world ever since. Perspectival representation now passes as quasi-natural and is largely unremarked as a system. Following the automation of perspective drawing through photography, the animation of the photographic image with the advent of cinema inaugurated a further stage in the naturalization of perspective. Across the 20th century, from Lev Kuleshov's notion of perceptual experience as films without film, through Pier Paolo Pasolini's definition of film as the written language of reality, to Hollis Frampton's idea of reality itself as an infinite film. The prevailing representations of the world were couched not only in terms of the framed monocular view of perspective, they were now submitted to the organizing principles of montage. But reality became viewed not only as intrinsically perspectival, but as inherently cinematic. In the 1930s, Walter Benjamin had spoken of wandering through the far-flung ruins and debris of the city that cinema had exploded. Today, it's cinema itself that is encountered in pieces. In addition to being seen in a movie theatre or at home on TV, DVD, or internet, a film may be encountered through posters, blurbs, and other advertisements, such as trailers and clips on YouTube. It may be encountered through newspaper reviews, reference work synopses, memorabilia, frame enlargements, production, photographs, theoretical articles, and so on. In my book of 2004, The Remembered Film, I call this expanded space beyond the confines of the movie theatre the Cinematic Heterotopia. For most of the history of cinema, the cinema goer could only intervene in this space by, for example, compiling scrapbooks of clippings from fan magazines, or by assembling collections of such items as lobby cards, and so on. Towards the end of the 20th century, however, the arrival of the domestic videocassette recorder and the distribution of industrially produced films on videotape put the material substrate of the narrative into the hands of the audience. The arrival of digital video editing on entry-level personal computers exponentially expanded the range of possibilities for dismantling and reconfiguring the once inviolable objects offered by cinema. Today's cinema audiences may now use online video editors to mix their own video mashups from inexhaustible streams of online images and sounds. The remixed Hollywood film trailer is typical of the mashup genre, often used to lampoon box office hits. Other mashups satirize prominent politicians or provide new image track accompaniments to popular songs. Assemblages of appropriated film clips and other found footage are also routinely encountered in the context of art galleries and museums. Video mashups cannibalize media contents external to the editing software used to assemble them. In contrast, the practice of machinima allows the production of films shot entirely with virtual cameras in such virtual worlds as those of video games and Second Life. Like mashups, machinima films are no-budget, extra-cinematic productions that emulate the look and feel of established cinematic genre through conventional continuity editing and montage. The game engines used in machinima production are evolving exponentially in terms of the complexity and naturalism of the environments they offer and the mobility of their cameras. Some of the more sophisticated of them are now available free of charge, in principle giving anyone prepared to learn them the ability to photograph and film with virtual cameras in increasingly naturalistic, simulated worlds. In addition to transforming the highly capitalized productions of the film industry, most conspicuously in the area of spectacular special effects, digital technologies are providing the de facto conditions for demotic practices based on the historic example of cinema, but with amateur and professional artists now enjoying equal access to the means of production and distribution. The French film theorist Raymond Bellour has observed that the epoch of classic cinema was one in which the moving image was confined to a single architectural and institutional setting, that of the movie theatre, but that there are moving images both before and after that appropriation, which in retrospect may now be seen as a parenthesis in the history of the moving image. It is in this perspective that I understand the expression post-cinema, to refer to the various moving image practices outside of the architectural and institutional setting of the movie theatre and its attendant industrial, economic, and institutional complex. The Hollywood studio system, the star system, box office ratings, the Oscar ceremonies, journalistic film criticism, and so on. The expression post-cinema does not imply that cinema is over. This is obviously not the case. Nor does it imply that post-cinematic practices are necessarily an extension or transformation of cinema. For example, I see my own work as situated less in relation to cinema and more at the intersection of such practices as photography, comic books, and architectural rendering. I understand the expression post-cinema, therefore, only as an inadequate placeholder for an evolving complex of moving image practices, largely consequent upon the arrival of digital technologies. In the 1930s, Benjamin saw the arrival of cinema as accompanied by a demand for the invention and elaboration of the concepts that would be required in order to understand the new regimes of the image that cinema would bring. The philosopher and film theorist David Roderick has given sustained attention to the question of cinema in the circumstances of digital technologies in his book of 2007, The Virtual Life of Film. Since writing that book, Roderick has turned his attention to art. In certain contemporary artworks, Roderick finds the intimation of what he calls a future memory of cinema, an anticipatory power, but also an interrogative one that investigates not only what the image has been, but also what the image is becoming. For the most part, neither mashups nor machinima depart significantly from the contents and forms of mainstream media productions. Although produced outside of the institutional setting of cinema, they nevertheless remain cinematic. The New Oxford American Dictionary defines the meaning of the word cinematic as relating to motion pictures and having qualities characteristic of motion pictures. The dictionary gives the example, the cinematic feel of their video. I'd rather assign my own works to the category of what I've elsewhere called the uncinematic. And at this point I'll introduce and show the first of the three works I'll show. The title of the work, which dates from 2010, is A Place to Read. Most of my still moving image works have their origins in invitations to respond to particular places, a city or a building. Prior to 2010, I worked in photography and video. But when I was invited to make a work in Istanbul, in the context of Istanbul 2010, cultural capital of Europe, I became preoccupied with a building that could no longer be photographed or filmed. The Tashlik Coffee House and Garden, constructed between 1947 to 48, had been dismantled in 1988 to make way for a large luxury hotel. The architect of the coffee house, Sedat Haki Eldem, had designed a modestly elegant building on a splendid site overlooking the Bosphorus, which synthesized the 17th century Ottoman architectural vocabulary with that of 20th century modernism. I made the building the focus of my work for two main reasons. First, it succinctly articulated the Ataturk Republican ideal of a modern and democratic Turkish national identity. Secondly, the destruction of Istanbul's heritage of fine public architecture in the interests of private profit seemed to me to be an emerging and urgent political issue. And we may recall, in fact, that 3 years later, in 2013, a brutal development plan for Gezi Park by Taksim Square sparked massive anti-government protests. When the Swiss Hotel Bosphorus was built in 1988, the Tashlik Coffee House was dismantled and part of it re-erected in a different position to be used as an Orientalist tourist restaurant. The former garden was turned into a car park, and where there was once a view of the Bosphorus, there is now the view of a rooftop tennis court, replete with advertisements from mobile phones. Rather than giving up the idea of working with the building, I abandoned the physical camera in favour of the virtual. My project became one of reconstructing the coffee house in the virtual space of a computer model to disinter the utopian imaginary of the Tashlik Cafe as it was at the time it was built. As befits a project of excavation, the completed work was shown in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. So I'll show that work now. My projection works are designed to be shown in art museums and galleries. The context of the gallery is different from that of the classroom setting in which we find ourselves now, just as it's different from that of the domestic space of television or the various contexts in which such mobile devices as iPads are viewed. I sometimes hear my projection works referred to as films, but there is a fundamental difference between a moving image in a gallery setting and one in a movie theatre. Although it's possible to enter a movie theatre after the film has begun and leave before it ends, it's normally assumed that the duration of the film will coincide with the duration of the spectator's viewing of it. In the gallery, it's normally assumed that these two times will not coincide, as visitors to the gallery usually enter and leave at unpredictable intervals. What we may call the time of the material, therefore, the time that elapses between the first and last frames in the digital file, will only rarely coincide with the time of the viewing. The non-coincidence of the duration of the material and the time of viewing suggests that the elements that comprise the work should be equally weighted and autonomously significant. In principle, any sentence should be able to occupy the position of first sentence, just as any image might be the first image. Although this theoretical requirement is rarely fully met in practice, it nevertheless exerts a constant influence on the form of my works. When I'm invited to show a work in a museum or gallery, I'm often asked how long the film is. But the question is largely inappropriate. Before going to see a film at the cinema, we might occasionally ask, how long is the film? Before going to see a painting in a museum, we would not normally ask, how long is the painting? The conditions of spectatorship of moving image works made for the gallery are closer to those traditionally associated with painting than those associated with cinema. The relation to the work is one of repetition, or more accurately, reprise. The ideal viewer is one who accumulates her or his knowledge of the work, as it were, in layers, much as a painting may be created. This type of relation to the work is very different from our relation to works of entertainment. It's one we may call contemplative, a word that today tends to be associated with passivity, but which once implied active interpretation. The etymology of the word contemplate is in the Latin verb contemplare, to look attentively, thoughtfully, and the noun templum, a place for observation, a place for the interpretation of signs. The Greek equivalent of the Latin noun contemplatio is theoria, theory. In the mid-20th century, Clement Greenberg judged that the history of Western painting had culminated in the recognition and celebration of its material condition as paint on a flat surface. I'm inclined today to judge that the historical import of painting now may lie not in the historical contingency of its material mode of production, but rather in its mode of reception, interpolated by a particular form of spectatorial address in a specific architectural setting, regardless of whether pigment or projected light is used to produce the event on the wall. Roland Barthes complained that at the cinema you're not permitted to close your eyes. Gaps, absences, and silences may be integral to the organization of a projection work for the gallery setting, places where nothing happens, where you may close your eyes and follow individual trains of associations. The temporal structure of a projection work specific to a gallery setting is in fact closer to that of a psychoanalytic session than to a narrative film. No part or detail of the material produced in an analysis is considered a priori more significant than any other. All elements equally are potential points of departure for chains of associations. But temporality in psychoanalysis is also characterized by reiteration. For example, in the symptomatic phenomenon of the compulsion to repeat, and the therapeutic principle of, in the title of one of Freud's essays, remembering, repeating, and working through. What in musical terms one might call the ritornello structure in scripto-visual gallery works has its structural analogies in such psychical mechanisms as deferred action, in which a previously anodyne event may become traumatic when recalled in different circumstances, or in the unconscious determinations of the sense of déjà vu and the uncanny. The psychoanalysts Jean Laplanche and Serge Leclerc characterize the reiterative fractional chains that form daydreams and unconscious fantasies as short sequences, most often fragmentary, circular, and repetitive. Projection works composed for the specificity of the gallery setting typically take the form of fragmentary, circular, and repetitive short sequences. The spacing of relatively autonomous elements in such works allows the possibility that viewers may see what is present to perception, not only through the recollection of previous elements of the work, but also through their own memories and fantasies. I'll now introduce the second piece, which is called Prairie, which was made last year, 2015, during a residency at the University of Chicago. In the years following the Second World War, centers of African American culture on Chicago's South Side were effaced by the development programs of the University of Chicago and the Illinois Institute of Technology. Little trace may be found in Chicago's Hyde Park today of the clubs along 55th Street, where some of the most innovative music in American modernism was created by such musicians as Thelonious Monk and Clifford Brown, and where Charlie Parker played his last Chicago gig at the Beehive Lounge. Bronzeville lost its stroll, the stretch of State Street between 31st and 35th, which flourished as business district by day and entertainment centre by night. Of the countless homes and businesses that fell to the wrecking ball, one building escaped anonymity and amnesia. The Mecca apartment building was built at State Street and 34th in 1892 and demolished 60 years later after a decade of resistance by its occupants as part of the expansion of the then Illinois Institute of Design under the plan of Mies van der Rohe, whose IIT Crown Hall building now occupies the former site of the Mecca. Prairie was first shown at the Neubauer Collegium in the context of the 2015 Chicago Architecture Biennale. The piece of ironwork that you see towards the end, if it were the end, but of course it's not, it's a loop. It's the only surviving piece of the Mecca. You can see it in the Art Institute of Chicago Architecture and Design galleries. It's hanging on the wall there. Jean-Luc Godard remarked that the relation between a text and an image is political. I can only approach the particular politics of text-image relations in my own works, however, by way of an account of how I view the politics of my art practice in general. But Sigmund Freud said that when he put on his hat and went into the street, he was no longer a psychoanalyst. If I go into the street to join a demonstration, if I boycott certain companies or goods, if I refuse to cross a picket line, or if I vote in an election, then my political engagement is that of a citizen. The fact that I happen to be an artist or an academic is of no more relevance to such actions than the fact that I'm right-handed. As Jacques Rancière observes, an artist can be committed, but what does it mean to say that his art is committed? Commitment is not a category of art. This does not mean that art is apolitical. It means that aesthetics has its own metapolitics. Rancière's view here is consistent with that of Marx and Engels before him, who saw little political value in Tendenzkunst, agitational art with a manifest political content. Just as Engels found revolutionary insights in the novels of the royalist Balzac, Rancière says that as an aid to thinking and writing democratic history, he finds it more useful to turn to the modernist writings of Virginia Woolf rather than to the social realism of Émile Zola. He finds that Woolf's way of, I quote, working on the contraction or distensions of temporalities, on their contemporaneousness or their distance, or her way of situating events at a much more minute level, establishes a grid that makes it possible to think through the forms of political dissensuality more effectively than the social epic's various forms. The metapolitics, specific to art, therefore, are not a matter of the representation of politics, but of the politics of representation. When Godard observes that the relation between text and image is political, we must understand the word relation for all it implies of spatiality. Writing in 2013, with no apparent irony in respect of his status as a best-selling novelist, the Norwegian writer Carl Ove Knausgård has remarked, I quote, "Wherever you turned, you saw fiction, all these millions of paperbacks, hardbacks, DVDs and TV series. They were all about made-up people in a made-up, though realistic, world. And news in the press, TV news and radio news had exactly the same format. Documentaries had the same format. They were also stories, and it made no difference whether what they told had actually happened or not. The nucleus of all this fiction, whether true or not, was a verisimilitude, and the distance it held to reality was constant. In other words, it saw the same. This sameness, which was our world, was being mass-produced. Consciously or not, Knausgård here adds his own voice to a long-established critical tradition. In the 1920s, Siegfried Kracau saw political implications for democracy in the newly emerging forms of mass entertainment he termed distraction industries. Krakau's concerns were subsequently elaborated by a succession of other cultural theorists. For example, through Guy Debord and Hans Magnus Enzensberger in the 1960s, with their descriptions of the society of the spectacle and the consciousness industry. To such more recent writers as the psychiatrist Félix Guattari and the philosopher of technology Bernard Stiegler. In a book of 2004, Stiegler argues that global media industries, cinema, TV, advertising, video games and popular music, now produce an ecology of the mind, which, I quote, rests upon the industrial exploitation of consciousnesses endowed with the bodies of consumers, which are degraded by this exploitation, just as may be certain territories or certain animal species. Writing in 1989, Guattari had spoken of a colonization of the unconscious by means of what he calls the media-based imaginary, arguing that market values and relations have not only penetrated the economic, social and cultural life of the planet, but have also infiltrated the unconscious register of subjectivity. Such writers have charted the progressive occupation of the terrain of languages, beliefs and values by market-driven mass media contents and forms that establish the taken-for-granted horizons of what may be habitually thought, felt and said. In this perspective, the political import of a work of art is a function of its complicity with, indifference towards, or resistance to, the hegemonic forms of industrialized common sense. It's through the prism of such analyses that I retrospectively understand Theodor Adorno when he writes that the social function of art is to be the social antithesis of society. In a closely similar formulation to that of Knausgård, Roland Barthes had already remarked in 1973, always new books, new programs, new films, news items, but always the same meaning. What interests me in Knausgård's view of contemporary cultural production, then, is not his view as such, this is already familiar, but rather the spatial terms in which he expresses it, as when he writes, "The nucleus of all this fiction was verisimilitude, and the distance it held to reality was constant." In other words, it saw the same. In the idea of a constant distance between representation and reality, Knausgård presents an image of cultural production whatever its provenance, in fixed orbit around a real it surveys with the same standard lens. It is in this spatial optic that I view the politics of text-image relationships in my work and the objects of attention they circumscribe. My works might reasonably be described as silent movies with intertitles. The description is objectively accurate, but would be totally misleading if offered to someone who had not actually seen the works. Intertitles in early cinema serve mainly either to represent speech or to provide expository information not available from the image alone. These functions of the text-image relationship in silent films closely parallel the mechanisms of anchorage and relay that Barthes, in his classic essay of 1964, Rhetoric of the Image, identified at work in the relations between photograph and text in print advertising and journalism. In anchorage, words reduce the range of possible meanings of an image by favouring some meanings over others. In relay, words add meanings to those already suggested by the images. So far, I've used the word image in the common sense meaning that distinguishes it from text. For example, to refer to a photograph I may hold in my hand and which reflects light into my eyes. In actual experience, however, the image is neither simply a material entity, a rectangle of paper, or an optical event, an imprint of light on the retina. It is also a complex psychological process. It's in this sense that the image is defined as essentially virtual in the phenomenological perspective that Gilles Deleuze derives from Henri Bergson. In this perspective, to put a written text together with a photograph, still all moving, is not to establish a hierarchy between categorically distinct entities, one censoring, illustrating, explaining, denouncing, or otherwise supplementing the other, but rather to juxtapose two autonomous virtualities in an encounter engendering further imaginary chains. Here, such analogies as anchorage and relay are no longer adequate, and others are required. In a 2005 interview, Jean-Luc Godard gives an example of what he calls a real reverse shot, which he takes from a book by the German physicist Werner Heisenberg, who, visiting his friend Niels Bohr before World War II, arrives at Elsinore Castle. Godard says, "Here the shot is the castle, the reverse shot, the description, Hamlet's castle. In this case, the image is created by the text. It's what poetry does, so that we don't just say the same things over and over again." Strictly speaking, Godard's example is one of anchorage. I nevertheless find his analogy helpful. It allows me to describe the relationship between text and image in other than consequential terms. As in the cinematic shot-reverse shot, it is as if text and image see each other from different places in a common space. A sequence of such alternating points of view may plot the topography of an imaginary, a terrain of variable geometry responsive to the associative contribution of the individual who looks and reads. The spatial alternations suggested by this model may also be identified in the narrative form of my works and the type of objects they narrate. In this connection, I'll turn to another analogy. The Canadian writer, Alice Munro, has said that when she writes a short story, and even when she reads stories by other writers, she feels she can start anywhere. She says, quote, "I don't take up a story and follow it as if it were a road taking me somewhere. It's more like a house. Everybody knows what a house does, how it encloses space and makes connections between one enclosed space and another, and presents what is outside in a new way. This is the nearest I can come to explaining what a story does for me and what I want my stories to do for other people." Munro goes on to say that in this house there is always a central room, but that this room is dark. For Munro, the dark room is the dark incident that so many of her stories relate. But in another part of her essay, she says that her stories are always built around an indescribable feeling. I would suppose that the more fundamentally dark room is that indescribable feeling, which is dark not necessarily in the sense of unpleasantly disturbing, like the anecdotes she relates, but dark in the sense of being obscured from direct knowledge. Munro's indescribable feeling cannot be shown. It can only be obliquely indicated through the relay of that which it is not. And here I'll suggest an analogy of my own, that of the invisible man. Every one of the over 20 film and television adaptations of H.G. Wells's 1897 story, The Invisible Man, has invariably had to find answers to the same question. How do you show the invisible man? We can probably all summon the image of the eponymous protagonist, swathed in bandages and heavily overdressed in coat, hat, gloves, and dark glasses. At the other end of the sartorial spectrum, in the original 1933 film version, a succession of footprints appears in a snow-covered field as the invisible man crosses the field naked. In yet another solution to the problem, a sudden gust of wind in a city street whips up litter which clings to the invisible man, betraying his presence. However, in spite of the filmmaker's ingenuity, in none of these instances, nor in any other, do we ever see the invisible man. We see only bandages, footprints, and detritus. Such is the inescapable condition of the work of art in its relation to the real. I'll now introduce the last of the pieces, which is called Belledonne. And it was commissioned by the John Hansard Gallery in Southampton in the UK, which formally opened at the University of Southampton in 1981 with the exhibition The Panoramic Image. The final exhibition at the Hansard Gallery, before its move to new premises, comprises works on paper by Roland and 3 projection works by myself. In fact, the 3 works I've shown here this evening, and that shows on at the moment. And the Hansard Gallery commissioned a new work for me for this show, and I thought it appropriate to inscribe references to the commission, in the commissioned work, to the first and the last shows in the original Hansard building, by referring to a period in the life of that, passed in the setting of panoramic view. Belledonne took its point of departure from a postcard from Saint-Hilaire-du-Touvet in southeast France, where from 1942 to 5, Barthes was a patient in a tuberculosis sanatorium. The postcard shows the panoramic lookout point with a view of the Belledonne mountain range in the French Alps. That's all, folks.